Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show. And what are we up to now? We are up to episode 23. First thing I wanted to talk about is how much this coronavirus panic reminds me of the AIDS panic of the 1980s, particularly what I dubbed some years ago Grace's law of the counterintuitive response. Now, for those of you who are too young to remember it, a new disease was identified in the early 1980s. It was originally called GRIDS, gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome, and this was later changed to AIDS for reasons of political correctness, just as we have seen with the coronavirus or the Wu flu, which we're now supposed to call COVID-19. Now, we were told at the time, and this reached a peak of hysteria, roughly, let's say 1985, 1986, that AIDS was everyone's disease, and that you may think that this is not going to affect you, but it is in fact going to affect you. Because if you have sexual relations with another person, you are effectively having sexual relations with every other person that that person had had sexual relations with in his or her life. Well, you don't have to think about that very long before you're liable to come to the conclusion that we're all gonna die. And a lot of people thought that in the mid-80s, that you would see some sort of, I don't know, red mark or maybe a bruise or something on your body, and you think, oh my God, I've got it. Oh, we're all going to die. Well, it turns out that that wasn't true. That the people who died from AIDS were in three categories in descending order. First, male homosexuals, promiscuous male homosexuals. Second, intravenous drug users, and third, those unfortunates who were given blood transfusions from infected supplies. Now, one might have thought that the political or social result of the AIDS panic, particularly after it turned out that, as Michael Fumento put it in a book which became a bestseller, that heterosexual AIDS was a myth. So you might have thought that this was going to lead to social and political changes with regards to the position of male homosexuals and intravenous drug users in our society. Well, precisely the opposite happened. That homosexuals and drug users were seen as victims. And astonishingly, the AIDS epidemic, despite the fact that we were lied to about it, led to the triumph of the gay agenda. In fact, it led to homosexuals, their spokesmen especially, lecturing the rest of us on sexual hygiene. We are doing the right things. You are not doing the right things. Do you use a condom every time? Even if you're not worried about pregnancy? Well, you have to wear a condom all the time. Not wearing a condom is the most grossly irresponsible thing in the world. Maybe one condom isn't enough. Maybe you should wear two. Maybe you should wear more than two. And I know I'm not making this up because I was in radio at the time, and I spoke to people who actually confessed this, or rather boasted about it, that they insisted on the use of two or more condoms. You know, what would the point would be going beyond that? I really don't know. But where did this lead us? It led us pretty shortly to gay marriage, to full legal rights and social rights for homosexuals. It led to gay propaganda in the schools, starting at kindergarten. And it led, at least in my country, to demands angry demands that every politician must be forced to march in what used to be called the Gay Pride Parade, but is now called the Pride Parade. There's a whole Pride Month now, as well as all of these other homosexual commemorations throughout the day, and various alphabet people commemorations throughout, not the day, throughout the year. So what happened after 9/11? Again, the counterintuitive response. One might have thought that the social and political position of Muslims in the United States and in the West generally would suffer because of this, but it was precisely the opposite. George W. Bush lectured Americans that the Koran was as integral to American culture as the Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount. Ramadan began to be celebrated at the White House. Fewer Muslim immigrants? No. We need more Muslim immigrants in order so that they can help us with our Islamophobia, with our prejudice. So what happened after the 2007 to 2008 economic collapse around the world? Again, Grace's law of the counterintuitive response kicks in there too, because one would have thought that it would have been the end for what Time magazine called the Committee to Save the World, the likes of Larry Summers and Alan Greenspan and Robert Rubin. No, it led to them getting even more power. The very men and the very institutions that had led the entire world into a near collapse of the global economy, well, they had demands. First of all, that everyone on Wall Street and the big players in the equity markets throughout the world, they had to be made whole. There was one sacrificial lamb on Wall Street. And furthermore, Capitalism 2.0, we have to go full speed ahead with that. Stop saving. Saving is bad. Saving is the old capitalism. Where will the money come from? The government will provide the money. And we need ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, or close to it, and we've reached that again. The solution to getting rich, the philosopher's stone, had been discovered. You just borrow enough money. You borrow enough money at practically zero interest rates, and then you financialize your institutions. It's not about making a product which people like. You turn your institutions into hedge funds and you buy back stock. Who could have seen that coming? Well, what is it? Ian Fleming said, and I'm going to be talking about Ian Fleming later in the show. He said that once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, 3 times is enemy action. We have been lied to about the coronavirus because the numbers aren't there to support the idea that we're all gonna die. Certain places in the world are suffering a great deal more than others. Well, China, of course, where the Wuhan flu originated, and Italy, where in the north of Italy there is not only the second oldest population in the world, but a large concentration of Chinese people who were brought in by the government of Italy to essentially to take over the ordinary work in the fashion industry, leather goods, and the like. These people were brought in from Wuhan and returned regularly for vacations. So what we have learned in the last few weeks that a panic is declared and demands are made. For instance, that, well, we're going to shut the economy down. Yep, the economy has to be shut down and people can't leave their houses. And people, I suppose, should wear hazmat suits if they go outside, but it's best if they don't go outside and in various places in the world, they have been ordered not to go outside. What might this lead to? Well, I'm going to talk in a few minutes about China and how the battle has already started between those people who are blaming China, quite rightly, for what has happened, and those people are saying, no, 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 no. China's the good guy in all of this. We should be grateful to the Chinese. They're actually saying that. And that attempts to decouple the Western economy from the People's Republic of China would be the worst possible thing to do. Well, what else have we heard? We've heard a lot about a universal basic income. And the universal basic income would solve, in one way, a problem associated with globalism. That globalism seeks endless efficiency. And what that means is that people in the West lose good jobs, and these jobs are taken to the East, where they are crummy jobs, the kind of jobs that lead people to throw themselves out of buildings such that suicide nets must be put up. How about we take tens of millions of people and put them on a UBI of $1,000 a month, and these people will never have to work. Now, you can't really buy very much with $1,000 a month, and you don't expect to get married or have a family or own a house, but those days are past. The days of middle-class people or even working-class people living the good life, globalism has put paid to that. Let's put people on a universal basic income of $1,000 a month, and they can learn to appreciate the deliciousness of beans if they're cooked correctly. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to happen, but I keep hearing, and we all keep hearing, about the prospect of the economy essentially being shut down for months. Now, does anyone think that the economy could be resurrected to the state that it was previous to the coronavirus if this shutdown goes on for weeks and months? It doesn't seem very likely, does it? So I think that there's a strong possibility that we will be informed that the old order has passed, and here is the new order, and get used to it, peons. It's sad, that China will continue to dominate the economies of the West, and it's sad, I suppose, that the 1% will continue to get richer and richer and richer, but there's no way out of it, because as I predicted yesterday, I don't know, in a month, some point like that, the authorities are going to say, our stern measures saved the day. The reason that so few people died, even compared to, typical influenza, is because of our sterling leadership. And so now we have some new demands for the world. Okay, so the Dow Jones is back above 20,000. Yay! And the VIX, the Scaredy Cat Index, was down 5.8%. I'm just going to read some headlines here. Senate GOP releases coronavirus relief plan with up to $1,200 in cash payments to individuals. Coronavirus live updates, U.S.-Mexico border restrictions expected. New York City has 3,615 confirmed cases. Trump advisor Peter Navarro slams Big Pharma's criticism of possible Buy America order. Well, there's a reason why Trump keeps calling this the China virus, to the absolute horror of the media, of the elite, because, we're not supposed to say where things come from anymore, because that would be racist and that would encourage stigmatization. And we have learned, just as we learned with AIDS, that the real killer was stigma. It's absolutely ludicrous, and it kills people to talk like this, But that's what we heard during the AIDS panic in the 1980s, and that's what we're hearing today. No, we can't quarantine people. We can't have mandatory testing because that would drive people underground and stigmatize them. Oh, well, no, we can't even close the bathhouses because that would be, wait for it, homophobic. I see that Jim Cramer says we cannot have the fat cats make money at the expense of the workers. He's absolutely right. He said that whatever corporate America looks like after the coronavirus crisis, CEOs should not benefit more than their employees. Like anything that protects the workers, Cramer said, we cannot have the fat cats make money at their expense. The Mad Money host was lamenting the moral hazards of the 2008 financial crisis. Well, as I say, we didn't learn anything, or we were told, Tina, there is no alternative. The smart guys got us into this mess, and the smart guys are going to get us out of the mess, and there's nothing you can do about it. Nothing at all. So Mark Cuban has been carrying on in the same way as Cramer. Mark Cuban, the billionaire owner of the Dallas Mavericks, of the NBA, and a reality TV star, said, whatever we do in a bailout, make sure that every worker is compensated and treated equally, in that the executives don't get rewarded extra to stick around because they've got nowhere else to go. Cuban said that bailed out companies should not be allowed to ever buy back their stocks again, not now, not a year from now, not 20 years from now, not ever. Because effectively you're spending taxpayer money to buy back stock, and to me, that's just the wrong way to do that. Well, you know, bravo for Cramer and Cuban. Now, so China is fighting back, and China's the good guy. Remember I said that the AIDS leaders were lecturing the rest of us on our sexual mores? Well, you see, China is lecturing us now about how to handle epidemics. And they're also telling a bunch of whoppers about the state of their own economy, which was already reeling from the swine flu affecting hogs, from over-leveraged banks, from Keynesianism run amok. And I suppose from the fact that it's just a Potemkin village. The whole country is a Potemkin village. But I see here that China may cut 2020 growth target to 5% from 6% previously, according to Reuters. We don't know whether the Chinese economy is going to grow 5% or 6%. I find that highly unlikely. Probably it's the case of whether it's going to contract by 5% or 6%, or I don't know, maybe 15, 20, 30, or 40%. But the Chinese are talking up a big game. My response to what Reuters had to say is that this is weapons-grade balonium. But for decades now, the West, and particularly financial reporters and those who have something to gain by it, have been talking up this legend of China's extraordinary growth. I see that Qualcomm says China demand has returned. So everything is well again. Because let's go back to the old rules where the fate of the entire world depends on the People's Republic of China. I hope we're going to have a discussion about how we got into this, but I don't think that the elite wants to have that discussion, because it will we'll learn out pretty quickly that one of the reasons we got into the mess is because it makes them money. It makes them an enormous amounts of money. Jonathan Paul has a typical cheeky comment. Ricky Bullock says, don't get me started on the taxpayer-funded giveaway to the banks and multi-billionaires. Yeah, well, it didn't start yesterday, right? As far as I can tell, it started with the Mexican bailout in 1994. And you see the confidence or the arrogance of Wall Street. What do you mean we have to pay for our bad decisions? I suppose you could see something similar in the Latin American collapse. We made a bunch of foolish loans, huge foolish loans based on preposterous projections of how these Latin American countries were going to grow, and it all went south. Now you have to make us whole again. And why? Oh, because bad things will happen if you don't. Brandon Smith says China has infiltrated Wall Street and the U.S. government as well, according to Sino Insider's expert analysis. If you see it, you'll understand. Ricky Bullock says no one with a brain wants to rely on the government for their income. Well, that brings up another problem, that in any welfare state, you have a considerable number of people who are paid for not working. But the welfare state depends on people who are working having enough surplus money through taxation to pay for those who are not. It depends on them also being willing to do this. My country of Canada is perhaps worse off than many others in this situation, and I must say that I have a vested interest in this because I will turn 65 on July the 2nd. But is there going to be enough money for pensions, both public and private? Are the young people going to be content to say, oh, no, we're not going to get to have a future, not in the way that that was enjoyed in the past, because we have a generation or two to pay off? Yeah, that could lead to some unpleasantness, to put it mildly. Jonathan Paul says iPhone factory job sounds good to me. I was watching some old episodes of Silicon Valley, and it was funny that Jared was talking about the app, the Saver app, Size Saver app, and how it had moved from the bat saliva and was infecting people. And a lot of this sort of stuff sounds prescient now. Ricky Bullock says, why does the world revolve around people who do nothing but take value from everyone else? Rhetorical question. There is an ideology that was made of capitalism. I mean, to a lot of people, capitalism is a dirty word. It's a Marxist word. It's a word that the left use. It's associated, with phrases like gnomes of Zurich. But you began to see in the 1970s, and this just became roaring in the 1980s, yes, capitalism. Capitalism is the source of all goodness in the world, and there was no goodness in the world before capitalism, and that the apex of capitalism is the entrepreneur. Now, it turns out a lot of these entrepreneurs are simply toll collectors, and it's a curious question how one can be, worth $60 billion like Michael Bloomberg by being a toll collector. Le Comte de Boreas says, coronavirus killed the progressive horse shit. You will not see another gay parade, women's march, and visiting China to have exotic foods. That's the dream. That's the dream, but I am not so sure. I'm not so sure at all. Because, again, consider what happened in 2008 and afterwards. One would have thought these people might be ashamed to go to the American public and say, we demand to be made whole, despite the fact it's being revealed how we lost all this money and how we exposed the world to the collapse of the economy. British American says Canada pensions will soon be a thing of the past. Get yours while you can, Kevin. Again, that's the dream. Brandon Smith says this crisis will likely be used to justify wiping away all handouts hereafter if government survives. Otherwise, it'll be replaced with new model that does away with it. Perhaps. I mean, Kunstler has been arguing for years that in the long emergency, government is going to become much weaker rather than stronger. But I think that there would be a lot of capital put behind the idea that essentially we are going to, create a floor or a ceiling, perhaps, of $1,000 a month or maybe $1,200 a month or whatever, Jonathan Paul says capitalism did well until the 1990s. Well, there's some people who call themselves the Austrian school who claim that there has been actual no organic growth in Western economies since the 1970s, and it's all due to easier credit. And I think that I think there's a lot to be said for that view. Now, when it becomes known that one can become successful and very rich indeed, stupendously rich, by gaming the system, well, the system is going to be gamed, right? I mean, you'd have to be a fool not to understand that. British American says if a university collapse and layoff of all admin leeches and SJW props is the only thing that happened, I would be delirious. Well, that's one of the reasons now why you're hearing this howling about the use of the word China or variants thereof with reference to the coronavirus. That the argument is going to be made, no, we need more people going to post-secondary education and not fewer in order to combat ignorance, racism, xenophobia. And there's going to be, there's going to be a big battle. There's no question about that. Let's see, getting back to the disease itself, and I'll be talking about numbers in a few minutes. Lance Welton writes on VDare, it's complicated. Chinese scientists find coronavirus discriminates by race and sex. And although our race-denying ruling class refuses to release the data, it seems increasingly clear that there are race and ethnic differences. But could there be race and ethnic differences in the size of the sex differences? Could women from one ethnic group be extremely unlikely to die of COVID-19 compared to their male co-ethnics, while women of another race are just marginally less likely? A new study from China, admittedly not yet peer-reviewed, suggests that this may indeed be the case. When the coronavirus epidemic started, I hypothesized, that is, I formulated a theory based on the available scientific evidence, that it might be substantially limited to East Asians. Indeed, I wrote that, quote, if I wanted to tempt fate, then I'd predict that, like the 2003 SARS outbreak, it would be more or less exclusive to East Asians, although this fact about SARS is apparently still not widely known. Well, it's widely known in Canada, but it's more than your job's worth to mention it in public. Now more evidence has come in, and it turns out that COVID-19 is more akin to Spanish flu than SARS. People of all races and ethnicities can catch it and die of it, even some from races that are generally strongly resistant. But COVID-19 certainly could impact some groups more than others. This makes sense, of course, because as Richard Lynn has repeatedly argued, for example, in his 2015 book, Race Differences in Intelligence, races are defined as breeding populations separated by geography for sufficient time to display average differences in gene frequencies. Let's see, I was asked to refer to a story that appeared in the Washington Post today. Hospital workers battling coronavirus turn to bandanas, sports goggles, and homemade face shields amid shortages. President Trump invokes war-scale manufacturing, but some worry about consequences of delays. One Seattle area hospital has set up its own makeshift assembly line using parts purchased from Home Depot and craft stores to create protective face shields for workers. Boston nurses are gathering racquetball glasses to use in place of safety goggles. In New York, a dialysis center is preparing to use bandanas in place of masks. Just 11 weeks into a pandemic crisis expected to last months, the nightmare of medical equipment shortages is no longer theoretical. Healthcare workers, already uneasy about the risk of infection amid reports of colleagues getting sick, and new data showing even relatively young people may become seriously ill, are frustrated and fearful. Trump responded to the growing crisis Wednesday by invoking the Defense Production Act to mobilize war-scale manufacturing for critical items, and federal health officials have announced plans to buy 500 million N95 respirators over the next 18 months. But it's unclear how long it will take to get the equipment to the front lines, and many worry that lives may be lost before such efforts catch up to a virus spreading exponentially across the country. Few hospitals have experienced a crush of coronavirus patients, but many of the supplies have been used up during routine care over the past few weeks, with no more on the way, amid global hoarding and the shutdown of equipment factories in China and elsewhere. Yes, turns out we're entirely dependent on China for this, just like we're entirely dependent, or almost so, on the production of antibiotics. How was that allowed to happen? Who will name the guilty men? We'll see whether they ever get named. So, another story here from, hang on a second, Ann Coulter. I've been rather displeased with Ann Coulter in the last few months, and I've compared her to a disappointed suitor or spurned lover in her constant blackpilling of Trump. But she has redeemed herself to a certain extent, anyway, or a large extent, perhaps, in the last few days. She wrote yesterday, here's a thought. Well, self-quarantining with the families in multi-million-dollar Manhattan co-ops, Wall Street wives ought to have a chat with their master of the universe husbands about China, globalism, and political correctness. Those are the vectors of their robber baron wealth. Thanks to globalism, i.e. cheap goods from China, we've gotten many wondrous things. For example, toothpaste on American shelves made with a poison found in antifreeze. Toxic Chinese drywall installed in about 100,000 U.S. homes, emitting noxious fumes that destroyed electrical wiring and metal fixtures and sickened homeowners. Replacement of the drywall, pipes, and wiring cost Americans billions of dollars. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of American dogs killed by melamine-laced Chinese dog food in 2007. The loss of about 200,000 beautiful maple trees lining the streets of small New England towns, eaten by Asian longhorn beetles that arrived on Chinese cargo ships in 1996. The U.S. taxpayer spends hundreds of millions of dollars to eradicate the repeated outbreaks that continue to this day, despite promises from the Chinese to do better. Viral pandemics. H1N1 from China, bird flu from China, SARS from China, and now the Wuhan virus from China. I should remark, with regard to invasive species, that it's not simply an accident that we get invasive species in the West. Many of these species, particularly fish, are brought here deliberately. They run amok in the local ecospheres, but we know all about this in my country, but it is more than your job's worth to mention it in public. And Coulter continues, is it really worth paying $3 for a t-shirt at Walmart rather than $9? The precise reason Chinese goods are so cheap is that they skip the crucial quality control step. I'd never really spent any time in Walmart until, I don't know, a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, say. And, you know, I'd look at trousers, jeans, whatever, and I was shocked by how inexpensive they were. But then I was similarly shocked on about the third washing when I saw that the crotch in the jeans was already beginning to go. And this is what is defined as a false economy. Coulter continues, the media's reaction to the latest pandemic out of China is to say, let's get one thing straight. The Chinese have nothing to do with this. Well, Like most animal to human viruses, this one did originate in China and then spread across the globe when Chinese tourists infected people in other countries. As described by Melinda Liu in Smithsonian Magazine, the Chinese wet markets, often poorly ventilated with multiple species jammed together, create ideal conditions for spreading disease through share-watered utensils or airborne droplets of blood and other secretions. This 2017 article was titled, "Is China Ground Zero for a Future Pandemic?" When the pandemic arrived, at least the World Health Organization leapt to action. First step, find a cure, develop a vaccine, demand protections for the elderly? No. WHO officials got together and worked on coming up with a new name for the Wuhan virus that sounded less Asian. Next, the WHO put out a fact sheet to ensure that those with Kung flu would not be stigmatized. It instructed, do talk about people acquiring or contracting COVID-19. Don't talk about people transmitting COVID-19, infecting others, or spreading the virus, as it implies intentional transmission and assigns blame. We see this happen with all sorts of words. There used to be something called venereal disease, and that was changed. I don't know. Venereal disease, it sounds bad. You know, I suppose there's not very many younger people who even remember the phrase, but it's sort of redolent of, the days of when syphilis was just a killer. If you got syphilis, you went insane and you went blind and you died in excruciating pain. So they came up with sexually transmitted disease. But disease, I don't know, that sounds bad. Sexually transmitted disease is sort of giving the idea that certain people are infecting other people, which is, of course, precisely what's happened. So this was changed within the last year or two to sexually transmitted infection. So it's a lot more passive. Coulter continues, as fear of the Chinese virus spread, Gloria Allred, yes, of course she did, brought a lawsuit against a Los Angeles school for sending an Asian student to the school nurse after he coughed in class. Gloria Allred has been, she must be about 80 years old now. She has been one of America's greatest public nuisances, for close to half a century or perhaps more. Americans are cowering in their homes. Airlines, restaurants, beaches, ski resorts, professional sports, colleges, and stores have been shut down. But we must never violate the fundamental civil right of an Asian to cough in class and refuse to see the nurse. The New York Times has also been on the racism beat with these pressing stories. 1, as Chinese grapple with a new illness, an old stigma is revived. 2, an outbreak of racist sentiment as coronavirus reaches Australia. 3, as coronavirus spreads, so does anti-Chinese sentiment. But, if you want to talk about colonialism, isn't this, Westerners going to places where they didn't live? And this was reviving anti-Western sentiment, which was fully justified. But no, when it works the other way around, it is never justified. A few weeks ago, before $1 trillion in wealth was destroyed by the coronavirus panic, and we learned the real disease was racism, everyone, including the New York Times, admitted that the virus was brought to Italy by 2 Chinese tourists. There had not yet been any confirmed cases in Italy, the Times reported, until January 30th, when the government announced the first 2 cases. The scientific director of an infectious disease hospital in Rome identified them. 2 Chinese tourists visiting Rome. The New York Times buried this fact in an article perversely titled, "Cruise Passengers Are Held at Italian Port in False Alarm Over Coronavirus." On one hand, a bunch of cruise passengers were inconvenienced for 12 hours. On the other hand, a viral pandemic that could kill millions was introduced to Italy. You write the headlines. Lombardy is the Italian region most devastated by the Wuhan virus as far back as 2003. A Library of Congress report cited Lombardy as having the highest concentration of Chinese immigrants in Italy. Our media refuses to tell us this fact today or any day. What good is the media? That's not merely a rhetorical question. Now, I can understand a media describing the facts, where this disease came from, how it was spread, while still making the argument. They can quote people in news stories, or they can write op-eds saying that it would be outrageous to exhibit prejudice against, Chinese in the West because of what's happened. No, but instead the media has decided that they are going to cover up what has happened. Ooh, where's all this racism coming from? Where's all this xenophobia coming from? Apparently, it's a mystery, or it is all Donald Trump's fault. Now, there's a great piece in the American Interest by a man called Andrew Mikta, who was the Dean of the College of International and Security Studies at the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies. He writes, "It won't be easy or painless, but the role China has played in exacerbating the fallout from the coronavirus crisis ought to force Americans to fundamentally reconsider the relationship." I flew back from Washington, D.C. To Munich just a day before the travel embargo from the Schengen zone to the U.S. came into effect. As I watched anxious gate agents, tense flight attendants, and passengers eyeing each other with suspicion, I could not help but think that what I was witnessing was the beginning of a radical recompilation of the mistaken notions that for the past 3 decades have shaped U.S. and European economic policy and indirectly international security. The idea that the People's Republic of China can become a responsible stakeholder in the international community, that they can be like us, is being laid to rest behind the mass basis of petrified Westerners scurrying through airports to get home. Again, this cannot be pointed out often enough, that the liberals, libertarians, neoliberals, whatever you want to call them, told us confidently and repeatedly with the utmost assurance that once China is invited into the world through the WTO and other organizations, that its totalitarianism will wither away, as the Marxists like to say. That did not happen. In fact, the very opposite happened. As China has become more economically important to the whole world, the country has become a nightmare. And what goes on in China today and for the last few years is far worse than anything that existed in the Soviet Union, well, certainly after Khrushchev's secret speech of 1956. Mikta continues, amidst the 24/7 breathless media coverage and calls for politicians to do something, one fundamental question still needs to be addressed forthrightly and in the open. Who did this to us, and what to do to prevent it from happening again? The question about assigning agency and blame is pretty straightforward to answer. The communist Chinese state, which for more than 3 decades has been draining capital and knowledge from the West, benefiting from our greed and myopia, has just let loose a virus that in the coming months is about to effectively paralyze Europe and the United States and bring severe pain, both human and economic, onto the world. The eruption at a wet market explanation for the virus has to be questioned until we know the full story, if for no other reason than the fact that Beijing suppressed data for 2 months when the coronavirus first appeared, and even to this day refuses to come clean as to exactly what happened. Indeed, the Chinese Communist Party is now spinning propaganda stories that both seek to somehow pin the blame on the United States and that try to frame their bungling, denial-ridden, heavy-handed reaction as some sort of model for the world. As a result of all this, the West is now shutting down, at least for a while. The ultimate cost to the world, in terms of new government debt, failed businesses, and human lives and suffering, is difficult to quantify at this point. But there are indications that the fallout from the Wuhan virus could be transformative. We must acknowledge our own complicity in what is now unfolding. Well, some of us more than others. The belief that globalization, through the radical centralization of market networks, was the unavoidable path forward. That idea has been exposed as a grave, near delusional miscalculation. The offshoring by corporations of supply chains to China has not only eviscerated communities that were previously reliant on manufacturing jobs, but it has also brought with it an unprecedented level of vulnerability and fragility to our economies. The populist revolts that have racked Western democracies for the past several years are in part rooted in the pain that these dislocations have caused. Worse yet, for the past 3 decades, this offshoring process has favored an adversary that is determined to replace us as the hub of global economic and military power and place itself at the new normative center of the world. Should the fallout from the Wuhan virus prove to be as damaging as it looks, the first casualty should be China's quest to become the premier manufacturing center for the world. Few corporations will want to again risk being caught in a situation where their entire supply chain has been locked into one country, much less a palpably hostile dictatorship. The subsequent era will, I hope, be one of strategic consolidation, with a special focus on onshoring critical supply chains that have been moved to China. Even the siren song of potentially vast consumer markets in China may end up being more than offset by the trauma we are about to face. But it would appear that the Chinese, never let a crisis go to waste. And of course, apparently, I've been told this all my life. I have no idea whether it's true or not. That the symbol for crisis is the same as for opportunity. Crisis-tunity, as Homer Simpson once said. Yes, but they got away with it in 2008. The Committee to Save the World got away with it, and the Chinese are betting that the same thing will happen now. Mont D. Law said, if you go toe-to-toe with China, you will lose. Brandon Smith says, the People's Republic of China is like a huge buffet where you don't get to eat anything and can't leave until all the dishes are washed, which they never are because more customers keep flooding in. Now, I've read many firsthand accounts of people who, and a lot of people from the West go to China for business these days. I suppose some of them take vacations for pleasure there, although I can't imagine why. But I've seen repeatedly the claim made that people who have gone to China, that, I don't know, unless you're eating at the Hilton or something like that, that, you can expect to get food poisoning on a regular basis. And I've seen many people claim that they simply stopped leaving their hotel room. Jonathan Pohl, well, I see that he's an entrepreneur. If I can sell just one book to everyone in China, I will be rich. Alternatively, you could just sell one book, but, if you charged enough money for it, as the old saying goes, you only have to sell one. Eternal Fisherman says USSR wasn't that bad after Stalin, frankly, but it wasn't a base paradise either. Plenty of crime in Russia from the late 1960s onwards. I think that what happened in the Soviet Union is they lost their bottle, as the British slang has it. And, we should be grateful for that. They just didn't have it in them to slaughter people over and over again, most of which they knew these people were not guilty of anything. And then, of course, the people who were responsible for the slaughtering, the NKVD, they themselves were slaughtered. The communist leaders were slaughtered. I mean, terror works, but I suppose there comes a point at which it is exhausting, and people just don't have the heart for it anymore. I see Jonathan Pohl agrees with me that the USSR did indeed become much less repressive than the PRC after 1956. I suppose there was this false dawn in the early 1960s. Khrushchev boasted in his book, Khrushchev Remembers, a book of interviews, Edward Crankshaw, I believe, put this together, that he was personally responsible for the publication of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. But Khrushchev got kicked out, and Brezhnev took over. I read a lot of books about the dissident movement in the Soviet Union, and as bad as it was, it's just nothing compared to China, just nothing at all. And one of the reasons is, and perhaps because of racial considerations, I would have to say that we're rather led to believe that, if terrible things are done to the Chinese people, well, who cares? I mean, this is from these very same people who are constantly accusing us of racism. Let's see. NWO Games Alert says Chinese illegal migrant workers in Italy were mainly busy sewing Italian trademark labels on illegally imported Chinese textiles. Supposedly there were 30,000 of them in northern Italy. And I guess that you only get a situation where you get 30,000 of such people if you're in your country, if it is, unless it is outrageously corrupt. And of course, there's no doubt in my mind that, that was the situation in Italy. That, for the longest time, for decades, Italy was just seen as a failed state, a mafia state, or, run by Freemasons. And let me tell you, the Freemasons in continental Europe are not like the Freemasons in America. Governments that, you'd have a dozen governments in 1 year. So let's go back to the news here, and I wanted to talk about what's going on in my own country. Now, I've searched assiduously for the number of cases of the coronavirus on Vancouver Island, where I live. The latest figure I could find was from yesterday, 16 cases. 16, count them, cases. And it's a ghost town out there. It's an absolute ghost town. And you can tell that the people who are on the street, they're going for groceries, or maybe they're just going for a walk because, people do need to get exercise, that they feel ashamed and that they feel afraid that someone is going to start shouting at them, perhaps from a balcony. What are you doing on the street? You're going to kill us all. There's 231 cases in British Columbia, 736 cases, all told. 31% of cases are 60 years or over. 52% of cases are male. 9 people have died of COVID-19. 9 people. I think the numbers are going to have to be produced soon, or there is going to be an enormous backlash. I mean, I really don't have any doubt about this. I mean, there's a limit to how much people are willing to take. Of course, there's always the possibility that the stats could be juked, and I certainly wouldn't put that beyond our elite. Not one little bit of it. Guy Benson writes in Town Hall, yes, blame China. One of the dumber controversies surrounding the Wuhan coronavirus pandemic is the rhetorical battle of whether it's racist or xenophobic to name and refer to the disease after the place it originated. Just today, President Trump began his press conference by discussing the all-hands-on-deck fight against the Chinese virus. And then these pissy reporters, and they're women, why do you keep calling it the China virus? Why do you keep doing that? And Trump yesterday was getting this reporter, this female reporter, to say it again, Kung Flu. Well, say it again. Say it again. One of the very favorite, I think maybe my favorite joke, is when a man says something and a woman says, that's not funny. And the man thinks, okay, this is a keeper. I'm going to keep going back to that well. Because if it's that easy to get you to fly off the handle, well, I mean, you got to do it. I mean, it would be irresponsible not to. Let's see. According to the story from Town Hall, David Harsanyi at National Review has written a scathing piece on this front. Quote, early on, the communists destroyed samples and suppressed vital information that could have helped mitigate the damage of this new strain of coronavirus. The government also silenced doctors who warned about the disease. Some were censured for spreading rumors or sharing test results with colleagues, and some were forced to write self-critical public letters, a Marxist mainstay, admitting that the warning had a negative impact. The Chinese communists probably let 5 million people leave Wuhan without screening, according to the Wall Street Journal. The Chinese communists, like all communists, hide their societal problems. There is no crime, disease, or addiction in the collectivist state. This kind of secrecy and dishonesty can be disastrous, especially in a highly interconnected world. That reminds me of something that I'm thinking of writers, well, from National Review, like Kevin Williamson, that the champions of globalism. there is no crime, disease, or addiction in the globalist state. All these claims about the white working class and their ills, this is grossly exaggerated, and this isn't really, it's wrong to speak of disease, although we're encouraged to believe that every kind of behavior is actually the result of a disease, because the people who are suffering this deserve it, because they're stupid and lazy and they didn't choose their parents well. Let's see. The Cato Institute, which are shills for globalists, part of the coctopus. David Beer of the Cato Institute, James Fulford reports, is saying that Trump banning China travel to protect Americans is just doing something he wanted to do already: protect Americans from foreigners, and we can't have that, can we? Quote, President Trump initially kept reasonable travel restrictions to prevent the spread of the coronavirus, but with the virus spreading inside the United States, he's already shifting from minimizing its threat to use it to justify restrictive immigration policies that he wanted anyway. A broader move to general nativism at this time would be disastrous, as so many immigrants are leading the U.S. response to the virus. Yes, I've seen those planted stories as well. A new analysis of government data from the Cato Institute shows that 8 of the major companies developing treatments and vaccines for the virus are heavily reliant on foreign workers, who are the best workers in the world. From 2010 to 2019, we found that the Department of Labor approved the companies developing treatments or vaccines for coronavirus to hire more than 11,000 immigrants and H-1B high-skilled foreign workers. Now, the planted axiom here is that Americans are substandard workers, substandard what? In education, in expertise, in conscientiousness, etc. Everyone knows this is not true. At the beginning of the book club, I was talking about Stephen Levy's book, Hackers. That apparently, America needs all these foreigners for its computer industry. Well, the computer industry was essentially, certainly the personal computer industry, was founded by Americans. All right? They didn't need any foreigners. It was Americans who did this. But no, apparently they can't do it, or they will not we won't let them do it anymore. Want to defeat coronavirus, writes David Beer in USA Today, protect legal immigration. This is just absolutely outrageous. If healthcare or big pharma want cheap labor from China specifically, then Cato doing the work of not just big business, but of the Chinese communists. How libertarian is that? Some spokesperson from the PRC says trying to move medical supply chains back to the U.S. from China is unrealistic and unhelpful, a wrong remedy for COVID-19 pandemic. Jesse Kelly responds, the only entities in America who can't see through this crap are the media and the Cato Institute. Okay, so, yeah, here's a picture of, what is this? Is this New York City? Times Square, new Times Square, close to it, something like that. Deserted. Pretty much deserted. Justin Fox at Bloomberg writes, remember a week and a half ago when CNBC's Rick Santelli said that maybe we'd just be better off if we just infected everybody with the coronavirus now? His reasoning, that in a month it would be over because the mortality rate of this probably isn't going to be any different than if we did it that way than the long-term picture. But the difference is that we're wreaking havoc on global and domestic economies. Unlike his most famous rant, a February 2009 tirade against mortgage bailouts and in favor of a Tea Party, this one probably won't help launch a political movement, given that Santelli apologized soon after, and political sentiment here in the U.S. seemed to shift firmly in favor of a tougher virus-fighting effort in the days that followed. But Santelli did raise a question that isn't going away. How do we know we aren't doing ourselves more harm with the measures we take to slow or halt COVID-19 than the disease would do to us on its own? A Stanford medicine and statistics professor, John Ion, it's a Greek name, a tough one to pronounce, a rather more serious commentator, put it in an essay for the science news site Stat this week after acknowledging that the coronavirus could kill tens of millions worldwide if simply allowed to run its course. With lockdowns of months, if not years, life largely stops. Short-term and long-term consequences are entirely unknown, and billions, not just millions, of lives may be eventually at stake. There are big problems with some of the claims made by Santelli and Jonitas. I'm going to pronounce it that way. Santelli is almost certainly wrong that the mortality at this rate probably isn't going to be any different if a large share of the population contracts it. We shall see. As time goes by, though, we're going to have more and better information. Are we? Really? I'm not so sure about that. Look, the United States just lived through this ridiculous episode where there was a coup attempt against the duly elected president of the United States based on a claim that Russia had hacked the 2016 presidential election. There is absolutely no evidence of this. Oh, a few $1,000s in Facebook ads were purchased. Oh, and how does that compare with what the billions spent by the parties? But you got the Mueller report, which ran on for years and turned out to be a bust. And then when the impeachment was voted on by the House of Representatives, there was nothing about Russia in it. It was all about the Ukraine. This is what Chomsky called manufactured consent. That you have the media, the elite, and a major political party saying, this is the truth, although there is no evidence for it. It is very difficult to fight that. And I believe something very similar has happened with regard to coronavirus. So, yes, we don't want people to die unnecessarily. But on the other hand, if the economy is going to be crushed, if it's going to be destroyed, then people are going to die unnecessarily, and probably a lot more. Oh, but here's another piece from the Washington Post by Joseph Steve. Americans must relearn to sacrifice in the time of coronavirus. When you read the Washington Post and the New York Times, and you hear from the elite, are they sacrificing? Because they seem to be constantly demanding sacrifices from people who have far less than they do. When Leo DiCaprio or Prince Harry and Meghan Mertz are told, hey, if you really believe in this climate extinction thing, why are you constantly flying around the world on private aircraft? What's their response is, it's regrettable, but it's necessary because we are your superiors. And it would be unfair to cheat the world out of my presence at events where I smugly tell you how the world must worse, because that will make me feel better. One NBC News poll conducted from March 11th to 13th showed that only 56% of Democrats and 26% of Republicans thought their daily lives would change significantly in the near future. And more recently, a poll showed that there were more than 3 out of 4 Republicans believe the media has exaggerated the risk of the virus. Yeah, well, further mandatory restrictions will hopefully change this outlook. Okay, they're just admitting it. Manufactured consent. Why is no one allowed to go outside? Because it is mandatory. By the 1970s, historian Elizabeth Cohen argues the idea of an elected official calling for sacrifice for common cause became harder to conceive. President Jimmy Carter found this out the hard way after giving his infamous 1979 malaise speech, calling on Americans to reduce dependence on foreign oil by expanding alternative energy sources and embracing conservation programs and public transportation. I've been hearing about this alternative energy since the first oil shock in 1973, and it's not here yet, not to any great degree, for the obvious reason is it's simply not economic. But if you want to know why there is, this reluctance for the little people to sacrifice. Look at the behavior of the big people. Look at, for instance, look up Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, and learned about how many of their sons served and or died in World War I and World War II. That 100 years ago, the elites in the West did have a sense of noblesse oblige, and they were not going to force other people's young men to go off to war if their own families were not going to take part. But no. We live in an age of specialization now, and that would be a waste of resources. Okay, I'm gonna look at the chat here just for a minute. Okay, I'll just catch up here. Brezhnev wanted to take out the Chinese once and for all. Sadly, Nixon sided with China. Okay, unable to connect to chat. Please try again later. Wow, this keeps happening this week. And I suppose I'm going to ask whether there's anything wrong with my feed. Just hang on a second here. Okay. So, okay, we talked about the Committee to Save the World. Boy, is that grandiose enough for you? And the claims made by China. Ramsey Paul had something interesting to say to this response. I just heard from a friend from Italy. They don't have the graveyards to bury the dead. Shame on Ramsey Paul and other alt-lighters for peddling outrageous actual fake news on the Chinese virus. I'm at the point where I'd support incarcerating people spreading it's just flu nonsense. Yes. Wow, let's start throwing people in jail. Okay? This is what they want to do with the climate denialists. We've heard this again and again. That they need to be thrown in jail because we can't have disagreement. There is an elite consensus that there is all this man-made global warming, which is going to, terraform the Earth into Venus, and the seas are going to be boiling. When's it going to happen? When are we going to get to the fireworks factory? Ramsey Paul writes, 640,000 people die on average in Italy every year. 2,978 have died so far from this virus. If they don't have graveyard room for the 2,978, where were they planning to put the 640,000 that die every year? But your sad photo of a coffin says more than logic could ever do. And yeah, people make predictions, and then eventually the actuals come in. And the actuals are coming in now. Let's see. Andy Graywall tweets, per first batch of coronavirus statistics from the Centers for Disease Control, fatality rate for those under 4 is 0.1% to 0.2%, as high as 27% for those 85 years or older, which is very high. Apply to that, and this is what we are destroying the American economy for. I don't know. I suspect we're going to be told that it's not destroying the American economy or the Canadian economy or the British economy or whichever Western economy. It's what right-sizing it, working out the inefficiencies. And as I say, one of the major inefficiencies would be people who shouldn't be earning a decent living actually earning a decent living, because, I guess these people, they get uppity. Some of them do. I think that was why the media reaction against the Tea Party was so virulent. That this was an American version of the Poujadist movement in France in the 1950s. And later, I suppose you could say, the Reform Party in Canada in the 1990s. It was essentially a revolt of the shopkeepers. That was a phrase that was used in France in the 1950s. Clay Travis tweets yesterday, 8,220 people died in America today. 18 were from the coronavirus. Now, you're going to get a similar reaction to this than you do about, hey, like where I live, why is it still cold? Why has this been, one of the coldest winters in memory, or certainly in recent memory? Weather is not climate. Oh, but over time it is. That sort of approach is not going to work with coronavirus, because this isn't supposed to, they're talking climate extinction. Oh, by 2050 we must. Well, 2050 is 30 years away, and there's very few people capable of imagining a world 30 years from now. Coronavirus is supposed to smack us upside the head and cause, millions or tens of millions of deaths within a relatively short time period. So back to Canada, and I will refresh these numbers. 271 cases in British Columbia, of which 16 are on Vancouver Island, 146 cases in Alberta, Saskatchewan, 20 cases, Manitoba 17, Ontario, which is our most populated province, 257, Quebec 121, New Brunswick 11, Nova Scotia 14, Prince Edward Island, that's a toy town province, 2, Newfoundland, which is a large island in the Atlantic, which is part of Canada, also Labrador on the mainland, 3 cases. 3 cases. And they're talking about martial law in Newfoundland. They're talking about huge fines for people if they do things like go outside. BC declared a state of emergency amid spread of COVID-19. What does that mean? Save on Foods temporarily bans reusable bags. Oh. That's where I shop, okay? That's where I get my groceries. And since they passed this idiotic law in Victoria, which is very gravely unhygienic, by the way, that reusable bags or plastic bags would not be used, I suppose it depends on what they're calling reusable bags. I hope they don't just mean plastic bags, the thin plastic bags, because otherwise you have to use the paper bags, which are difficult to carry for long distances because they don't have handles. And if it rains, which it often does here, there's a serious possibility of everything in your bag falling out of it and landing up on the ground, with much of it smashed. I hope that by reusable, they mean the more formal bags, the real, disease locuses, right? Because those were always a bad idea, and the economics is simply not there. Yes, again, Newfoundland. Oh, Newfoundland and Labrador. Yes, it had been Newfoundland forever, and then they decided that the province's name was going to be Newfoundland and Labrador because Quebec has a problem with Newfoundland's occupation of Labrador. I don't know why people call it, by 2 names when everyone understands that Newfoundland includes Labrador. But it's like Hawaii. We're going to put an apostrophe in there, and then people are going to foolishly try to figure out how to pronounce it with the apostrophe in it when there's no need. Okay, despite the fact that that COVID-19 virtually does not exist in Newfoundland, the province announced several restrictions, including the immediate closure of fitness facilities, bars, movie theaters, and arenas. Restaurants that can meet the social distancing measures will be allowed to remain open at half capacity. The province is also banning gatherings of more than 50 people and is requiring anyone returning from another country to self-isolate for 14 days. Among the penalties for failing to comply with these regulations include a fine of up to $2,500, a jail sentence of up to 6 months for an individual, and a fine of up to $50,000 for corporations. And yeah, this is the other side of the so-called blitz spirit, where you have these petty people looking to make other people suffer. I mentioned a real-life true example of old people during the blitz who had forgotten to turn off all their lights, and then they get hauled off before the magistrate with wicked people, chortling, we're all in this together. They think they can live by their own rules, etc., etc. And I guess we have got to that point now. Meanwhile, there's still people entering Canada illegally, just walking across the border. But these asylum seekers, so-called, are not being subject to mandatory quarantine. How about that? And this is part of the, this is what Trudeau has done. The whole world is talking about it in a favorable way, as I mentioned from Glenn Pearson's column yesterday. Bill Blair confirms illegal border crossers are still being allowed into Canada, but says the government is now doing medical screening and housing them when necessary in quarantine. But, we're not going to close the border because, again, that would be xenophobic, that would be racist. And apparently large public gatherings are illegal now, but approximately 100 masked Antifa members marched through downtown Montreal on Sunday, despite current COVID-19 health recommendations. The demonstration was part of an annual protest against police brutality. I think it's actually more of a protest against the police itself, because the left has moved on from police brutality to the existence of police in certain, shall we say, ethnic neighborhoods, that the justice system is racist. So, let's just give up on it. The Prime Minister of Canada said closures, social distancing measures could be in place for weeks or months. Yeah, we're just going to shut down the economy for months and then we'll just start it up again. Yes, and we have heard curiously little about Justin Trudeau's wife, the lovely Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, who apparently is the patient zero of the celebrity community. Idris Elba hinted very broadly that he got it from her when she was talking at We Day in Britain a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, okay. So, Canadians are being asked to stop panic shopping. Are they listening? The key point may come when new border restrictions come into effect. And there's a picture of a grocery store, and it is a Save on Foods in North Vancouver, BC, and the shelves are empty. Yeah. So the border with the United States is going to be closed, and a great many things that Canadians buy, including food, not all food, but a lot of it, comes from the United States. As I pointed out many times, Canadians don't really produce things anymore in terms of the destruction of manufacturing capacity. Well, it's actually worse in Canada than it is in the United States. And there's just the assumption that, no, we moved on from that. Just foreigners will make pretty much everything. And we'll work in the services industry, except that there's very few prominent companies in my country that are actually owned by Canadians. Canadians like to think of themselves as great beer drinkers, and beer is considered, beer drinking is considered one of the primary attributes of Canadian culture. You have to go down to the number 18th most popular beer in Canada to find one that is actually Canadian owned. the famous Canadian beer companies like Labatt and Molson, they were bought by foreigners quite some time ago. That doesn't stop them from posturing as Canadian. Perhaps they hope that people don't notice, in the same way they hope they don't notice that Tim Hortons is actually owned by a Brazilian hedge fund. So here's a story which indicates that perhaps the public is not buying into what our leaders have in store for us. Economic impact of COVID-19 is more of a concern than the health effects poll finds. It's from the Toronto Star. The campaign research survey provided to the Star found a staggering 99% of respondents are aware of the crisis and 93% are worried about the economy. You just never see those kind of numbers, Richard Ciano, a principal of campaign research, said. The poll found only 5% were not worried at all about the outbreak. And 3/4 of respondents, 74%, said they have not sold any holdings because of the pandemic, while 7% said they had, and 19% said that they didn't have any investments to sell. The poll found 89% said they were concerned about the overall toll the virus will take on Canada. Campaign research found that 82% were concerned that they themselves could contract COVID-19, while 17% were not concerned at all, and 1% weren't sure. So it would seem that members of the public are looking at the equation, on the one hand, provide maximum safety for as long as it takes, and on the other hand, destroying the economy in the probably vain hope that it can be resurrected. Oh, but the Globe and Mail is very much not happy with what's going on. The Globe and Mail, some wag years ago, described the Globe and Mail as the newspaper of the gay stockbroker. John Ibbotson writes that closing of borders could be the most lasting harm from this coronavirus pandemic. In the 1930s, the United States raised tariffs on goods coming in from Canada, which retaliated with new tariffs of its own, worsening and lengthening the Great Depression for both countries. If you say so, Ibbotson. Wednesday, in an effort to limit the spread of the coronavirus, President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau agreed to partially close the Canada-US border, which likewise will worsen and lengthen the mutual economic damage from the pandemic. Walls, once up, don't easily come down. In the long run, the most lasting harm from this pandemic could be the closing of borders, the closing of minds. Has this fellow heard of the telephone, telecommunications, satellites, the internet, the telegraph, the closing of minds? Yes, we need people traveling halfway around the world on a regular basis. Otherwise, no one will have any idea what's going on in the rest of the world. I read things like this, and I think, they don't really believe that, do they? The COVID-19 attack accelerates the ongoing weakening of globalization, which some see as a good thing. For them, this pandemic is simply the latest evil of modernity. COVID-19 is but a modest emergency compared to what's coming in our crowded, mobile, just-in-time delivered era of hyperglobalization, the journalist Andrew Nikiforuk wrote in the Tyee. I knew Andrew Nikiforuk from way back, from the early 90s. He's a respectable person in Canadian journalism, but what he has to say, modest emergency, yeah. For even defenders of open borders, whether the world order built up over the past 7 decades will survive the combined ills of the pandemic and the Trump administration. Here's hoping. This pandemic is reshaping the geopolitics of globalization, but the United States isn't adapting. The American political science Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman wrote this week in Foreign Affairs magazine. Instead, it's sick and hiding under the covers. No, it's sick and hiding under the covers would be to say our dependence on a hostile foreign nation with, let's say, certain low standards in certain areas is dangerous and uncalled for. but to replace the free flow of goods, people, and ideas. Again, how do border controls control the spread of ideas? But maybe from China. But even during this pandemic, people were sending out YouTube videos and the like. I mean, they were brave people. Last year, for the second year in a row, as many girls as boys sat the primary school graduation exams in Kenya and achieved a higher average score. That's globalization. You see, we must be beggared so that girls can go to school in Kenya. You kind of wonder how the one follows the other, but last year as well, Taiwan became the first place in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage. That's globalization. I don't think he's making the best case here. When this pandemic ends, will the walls come down, or will governments find it easier and more popular to continue restricting the entry of foreigners? Will they decide to become more self-sufficient, even if economic isolationism leaves everyone poorer and less innovative? Oh, everyone poor. Yes, he's talking about the aggregate again. And the aggregate is not interested in average or median wealth. If a bigger aggregate means that the likes of Mike Bloomberg and Jeff Bezos become, I don't know, richer than Andrew Carnegie was, and he actually built things, well, that's not a problem, because the aggregate is bigger. If people can't afford to get married or have children or to buy houses, well, they can get one of those little dogs and call them fur babies. That's just as good as having a child of your own, right? And, in these times of climate extinction, is it really responsible for people to have children anyway? I mean, the rich people are still having children, but they can afford it. So it is responsible for them. Now, the rich have changed the rules so that the poor can't have, or the middle class, more to the point, can't have children anymore. But again, these people should have chosen their parents better. Canada is a trading nation, a nation of immigrants. No, it's not, actually. It was a nation that was made by settlers, by colonists, specifically by British Empire colonists. A nation open to the world. When this pandemic ends, we should lead the world in tearing down walls, internal as well as external, and championing the greatest possible openness among economies and peoples. The alternative is a return to the insular, frightened planet of the 1930s, and that we must avoid at any cost. It's always Munich. It's always Munich with these people. Well, that was a long time ago. Neville Chamberlain, like, who was he? I mean, they've been getting away with this for the longest time, that do as we say or you're going to get Hitler. Well, we have done, as you've said, and we've got the Communist Party of China, which is determined to wipe out the Uyghurs, to breed them out of existence, to imprison or shoot the men, and then force the widows to marry Han Chinese. That's globalization too, John Ibbison. Okay, so one final check of the chat. And yeah, I'm not seeing any comments here. That's a shame. I don't know why this keeps happening. I'll just try this. Could it be possible that the comments have been turned off because of offensiveness? I didn't see any. Okay, so let's move on to Theater Thursday. And we are going to be discussing a film from 1969? Yes, 1969. And it's called On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And it is the first and only Bond film. It was the sixth in the series. It was directed by Peter Hunt. And it is the only Bond film to star the Australian actor, formerly male model, called George Lazenby. I want to talk a little bit about the James Bond cult in the 1960s because I rather grew up in it. That the James Bond cult was so big that it was possible to make really a parody film about it. And this film was a success, a rather large success. And I'm speaking about a film from 1967 called Casino Royale. The film was rather remade some years later, and a very grim film it was, the remake. This Casino Royale, the 1967 version, is an absolute mess. Let's see, how many directors do we have? Well, we have Ken Hughes, John Huston, Joseph McGrath, Robert Parrish, Val Guest, Richard Talmadge. We have a whole host of writers. Apparently Billy Wilder, no less, was involved in writing for it. And apparently Woody Allen, who appears in this movie, wrote his own material. And he's quite funny, I must say. It's kind of embarrassing to admit, but when I was 12, 13 years old, Casino Royale was my favorite film. Let's see, why would it be my favorite film? Because it was wacky. My word, it was wacky. And there's a whole bunch of non sequiturs in it, and constantly shifting from one place to another with all these different characters, sort of thing a teenage boy would like. The music by Burt Bacharach, who I loved then and love now, and it is performed, most of it, by Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass, who I loved then and I love now. In fact, one of the stories about Casino Royale is that the soundtrack album, which is the first record that I ever bought with my own money, is famous as a test record to this day. And I'm talking about the LP, of course. And they brought it out on compact disc, but it's not the same. Apparently, people pay hundreds of dollars or more than that to test out their systems. The kind of people who buy voltage regulators for their stereos. So you're going to get that regular voltage, big battery. You're not going to have any, spikes or anything like that. These are the kind of people that would buy the Casino Royale soundtrack. Also, another reason why I liked Casino Royale, the original one, so very much is that it really has an incredible number of beautiful women in it. And that was always a feature of the Bond films. That pretty much all of the women that are cast in the Bond films back then, unless they were, villains, and some of the villains were good looking too, but they were all good looking women. I mean, it was not a realistic world in any regard. But with, I see Nicholas Roeg worked on this film too. And who was in it? Peter Sellers was in it. And Peter Sellers had this strange idea, despite the fact that this movie is a spoof, that he was going to play James Bond as James Bond. And there was some resistance to this idea, and so he left the film about halfway through, and they used shots of people's backs and him making unrelated jokes while on the soundstage in an attempt to hold things together. Ursula Andress, who of course was in Dr. No, is in it. David Niven plays Sir James Bond, and he's brought back from retirement. I mentioned Woody Allen, Joanna Pettit, Orson Welles, the Israeli actor Dalia Lavi. Back in those days, before cable TV or pay TV, as you might call it, before videos and before DVDs and Blu-rays, what people did was they memorized movies. And my best friend at the time, Andy, we saw this film when we lived in, it was playing at what you might call a second-run theater, the Cedar V in Lynn Valley in North Vancouver, and we must have seen it, 6 or 8 times. And between us, we'd pretty much memorized the whole thing, and we would trade lines back and forth constantly so that we kept it. And I didn't see that after about 1970. I didn't see the movie again for about 25 years, and I thought, this is really stupid, but it is kind of lovable. I think that that notorious bomb Hudson Hawk. I think that Casino Royale, the original, must have been, an homage, because we're just going to throw everything at the screen, as they say. And there's going to be enough famous people here, and there's going to be enough funny people, and there's going to be enough beautiful women that some of it is going to work. Actually, a story about Peter Sellers, one of the funniest men who ever lived, but a very nasty man. On the set of Casino Royale, he accidentally shot Jacqueline Bisset in the face at close to point blank range, with a blank round, accidentally. But I don't know. A lot of people were scandalized by Casino Royale, but already by that time you'd had a hit sitcom called Get Smart about the world's stupidest secret agent, Maxwell Smart, and the lovely Barbara Feldon playing his partner, who constantly saved the day. You had The Man from U.N.C.L.E., which was pretty arch, pretty arch. You had The Avengers, which was pretty arch too. There just seemed to be no limit to how parodic. In fact, there was a whole series of such films, Modesty Blaze, and it's just, okay, he's a secret agent of some sort. There's danger involved, beautiful girls, I don't know, location shooting, gadgets, and people want to see that, and they did want to see it for the longest time. Now, the movie that came out, the official Bond movie that came out directly before On Her Majesty's Secret Service, was You Only Live Twice. And it was Ian Fleming made this, Sean Connery made this film, and he decided afterwards that, he was done. Now, they brought him back later for, an enormous amount of money. But I remember seeing this film when it came out, and I was very, very impressed by it. Exotic locale, Japan, the best, in my opinion, a Bond theme, beautiful song written by John Barry and the words by Leslie Bricusse. You Only Live Twice, sung by Nancy Sinatra. Really, really beautiful song. And Ken Adam did the astonishing art direction. How many times have you seen, villains in a hollowed out volcano, or seen, these men rappelling down for vast distances, as they're being cut down with machine gun fire? I mean, You Only Live Twice is one of the most parodied films ever made. I mean, it's really at the heart of Austin Powers. And let's see, Ernst Stavro Blofeld. Donald Pleasance plays him, and I think that he is the best Blofeld. I think that he's certainly better than Telly Savalas in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, because Donald Pleasance, he's a very odd person. There's the scarring again, Austin Powers, but he seems to be not quite of this world, whereas Telly Savalas is trying to impress us in On Her Majesty's Secret Service by how charming he is, and his attempts to seduce Diana Rigg are kind of risible, not least of which because Telly Savalas was perhaps the ugliest man in Hollywood history to become a major star. I always thought that Telly Savalas was much better suited to playing the psychotic rapist murderer that he did in The Dirty Dozen. And of course, on Her Majesty's Secret Service has a great car, the Tokyo 2000 GT, open top, and the gadgets, these little miniature helicopters, outstanding. But the script was written by Roald Dahl, the famed children's author, and it wasn't until much later that I realized that he was taking the mickey, as they say. There's one of those scenes that you see a lot in Bond films where he's taken prisoner, he's kidnapped, rather easily, as it turns out. Early on in the film, and you think, wow, this is pretty early. Isn't this stuff supposed to happen, near the end, when the truth about the fiendish plan to take over the world is going to be revealed by our supervillain? But it turns out that it's the good guys who are kidnapping James Bond, and he is kidnapped by Tiger Tanaka, who is the head of the Japanese Secret Service. And there's a scene in it which mystified me for years, and then I realized that it was a piss take. That this elaborate contraption, again, Ken Adams as well, where there's the floor falls out before James Bond, and you see him sliding down, this tunnel, this enormous tunnel, and then he, falls into a chair, right? There's Tiger Tanaka, the sub basement. So, explains the situation, and the sake is brought out. And so Bond drinks the sake, when in Japan. And so Tanaka says something like, "Oh, Bond-san, I see you like sake." And Sean Connery says, "Yes, especially when it's served at its proper temperature, 98.4 degrees Fahrenheit." That's a terrible imitation, but you get the drift. And I thought, 98.4 degrees Fahrenheit, but I can't be expected to remember this. There's too many rules in the adult world. 98.4? And then later I thought, there's not a single person in the world that could distinguish between a liquid at 98.4 degrees and 98.6 degrees. Secondly, were the glasses that the sake was served in, were they heated to 98.4 degrees Fahrenheit? Because, as soon as it comes out of the bottle and into the glass at room temperature, it is going to be rapidly seeking to reach equilibrium. But then, as I say, the whole thing was a piss take. So, You Only Live Twice was a huge success. It sales and the like. But Albert Broccoli and Harry Saltzman decided that they were going to tone it down in the next one, and it's shot out of sequence with the novels, which causes some problems with the employment of the aforementioned Blofeld. But Sean Connery didn't want to do it anymore, and there was a talent search, and Albert Broccoli saw George Lazenby, the Australian, in some chocolate commercial or whatever, and hired him. Apparently Lazenby got some advice after the movie came out that you shouldn't do any more of the films because, well, they're really sort of trivial. Also, you'll get typecast. This was very, very bad advice. If you star in Bond films, several Bond films, you're going to become a star, and then you can do what you want. I mean, of course, Sean Connery had a film career going back to, 1954. He was in the Disney film in 1959, Darby O'Gill and the Little People, to give one example. He was in The Longest Day. And, he was in Hitchcock's Marnie. That is to say, he went back and forth between what you might call, art films with the James Bond films. And it worked out very well for him. But Lazenby got some bad advice. I think he's quite good in this. I know a lot of people hate him, because he's not Sean Connery, but Sean Connery was too much of the Gorbals to be ever really James Bond. I mean, as good as he was, I mean, he was not Ian Fleming's James Bond, and I think that Lazenby does just fine. Now, we're not supposed to call them Bond girls anymore. No, they are Bond women. Oh, okay. Well, okay, I understand now. I won't make that mistake again. But the Bond girl in On Her Majesty's Secret Service is played by Diana Rigg, and, well, no one's going to call her a girl. She's a very formidable woman. Go ahead, you just have to look at her in anything that she has been in. And she elevates the seriousness of the movie, because the novel, and in this movie, I'll talk about this with regard to Kingsley Amis's book, James Bond Dossier, that one of the appeals of James Bond is that he is a wounded Byronic hero, that he has a secret sadness. And here's a spoiler, I'm talking about a movie that's over 50 years old, but James Bond marries her. And it seems to be it is a love match on both sides. And then she gets murdered in the final scene of the movie, and James Bond seems to have been robbed of his wits because of it. That's how much of an effect it has on him. So the plot of the movie is that Bond has been searching for Blofeld for quite some time, and he's told, to knock this off. He resigns, but Moneypenny doesn't hand in the message, and James Bond is grateful for that. He has a clue. He has a clue that a Corsican gangster knows where Blofeld is. And again, to refer to Kingsley Amis's novel, you see a lot of these characters in the James Bond novels that, objectively speaking, they're bad people. But in the Bond world, they are good people for two reasons. One, because they work with Bond, they are on Bond's side. And two, because they are patriots. And of course, we see James Bond. We see a picture of the Queen, of Queen Elizabeth, and several scenes of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and there is no question that Bond venerates the Queen, he venerates the monarchy, he venerates the idea of being an Englishman. It's not an over-top kind of patriotism, but to him, Britain is his country, and it is the best country, and all reasonable people must agree. So Gabriele Ferzetti plays Marc-Ange Draco, head of the Union Course, and he turns out to have a daughter, and her name is Teresa, played by Diana Rigg. There had been a meeting at the hotel, and of course, whenever James Bond shows up at one of these places, the assumption is that someone's going to break into his room to find out why he's there, or he's going to be thumped, or someone's going to try to kill him, or he's going to be kidnapped, as this happens. So the gangster has a plan for James Bond, a kind of trade. It's rather ugly in its transactionalism, that he thinks that his daughter would be a good match for James Bond. He's done all this research into James Bond. His daughter was a spoiled society girl who got in with a bad crowd and had a bad first marriage to a man who was, more irresponsible than his daughter was. And we're drawn, towards liking this Corsican gangster because he is a widower. It's clear that he had an enormous fondness for Tracy's mother, and he clearly deeply loves Tracy. But being offered a million pounds, golly, which is worth what, like 25 million pounds today, in order to marry some girl. It sounds an awful lot like prostitution, doesn't it? So it turns out that we do find out where Blofeld is, that he's in Switzerland. Why is he there? Well, because he has an institute, about which we learn more later. Kingsley Amis complained that all the heraldry stuff in the novel, there wasn't much of a payoff for it, but there's much more of a payoff for it in the movie because it's visualized, and we get to see handsome, hunky George Lazenby playing an effete genealogist. And one of the running gags is that he's so effete that he must be homosexual, and to the delight of the girls, he isn't. And how about that? It's not the kind of joke that one could make today, but that's one of the reasons I like movies like this. They're more realistic, and this is, as far as a James Bond film goes, this one is exceedingly realistic. And real locations are used in Switzerland, at the top of a mountain, the Piz Gloria, and the movie really benefits from this. The photography is absolutely outstanding, and it looks, flying helicopters up, 12, 13,000 feet or whatever. I mean, this is clearly dangerous. Everything, all of the stunt work and the photography, it really, you can see the care that was put into it, and you can appreciate how much trouble they went to get these shots, and indeed how dangerous it is. So in terms of Bond girls go, well, we have a whole host of them. And they come from all around the world. And they suffer from allergies. And they are imprisoned in this chalet. And Blofeld, who is attempting to pass himself off as a count, that's why he needs the genealogist. He is brainwashing them through autosuggestion to poison the world. And it's a typical Bond plot where he's going to reveal his sinister plan and ask for, I don't know, $5 million or something, what seems like a pitiful amount of money. But the girls are delightful, and they are really good-looking women, I must say. There's Angela Scular, who was also in Casino Royale. Lovely girl, sad life. Katharina van Schell. Joanna Lumley, you all know about Joanna Lumley. Julie Iga, who was Miss Norway. Jenny Hanley, who is the daughter of Dinah Sheridan, who was in Genevieve, which we talked about on Theater Thursday. Perhaps the most beautiful, Anushka Hempel. Anyway, it's all absolutely top-notch. And there's all of this sort of giggling and, oh, yes, could you come to my room, that sort of thing. But at the same time, Bond is a prisoner there, and, we've learned that you do not want to be an unwanted person at Piz Gloria because you will be killed. It's that simple. And they don't ask any questions. They just kill you. So when the full extent of the plot becomes known to James Bond, well, he is imprisoned. And, of course, why isn't he killed? Well, that's not how it works, all right? And you can either live with it or not live with it. But I have to say that there's a series of stunts which involve getting from the top of the mountain to a valley and a cable car and pulling oneself along the cable as the cars are going back and forth. And it looks absolutely terrifying. And as I mentioned yesterday, why this is such a great stunt is that it's not just that it looks dangerous. It looks like something that you perhaps could do, but you wouldn't want to try because it looks too dangerous. Oh, there's a 1 in 10 chance of accomplishing this, because, 90% chance you'll be killed. Well, who's going to take those odds, right? Well, it's James Bond's job to take those odds. And so he manages to escape, or so he thinks, and then he's chased by a bunch of expert skiers who have submachine guns. And Bond is reduced to one ski. The skiing stuff is fantastic. There's an actual avalanche. And so Tracy re-enters the picture. There is a tremendously fun car chase on ice, which is something I don't believe that I've ever seen before. And there's a very sweet romantic interlude in a barn. And then just great stuff with a bobsled. Bobsled race. I'd never seen that in an adventure film before. Of course, people will say that when Blofeld gets, ejected from the bobsleigh route and he gets thrown into a tree, yeah, well, he would have been killed instantly, but, that's not how these things work. But I talked about Blofeld, our villain, and how I don't think that Telly Savalas is all that successful. And you need a great villain for this kind of film. But luckily, we do have a great villain, Irma Bunt. She is not a million miles unlike the character that Lotte Lenya played in From Russia with Love. She is, I don't know, sort of a Mutti Merkel character. She's this grim, unbelievably grim German, I was going to say Das Ewige vibe there, but there's little of the woman about her. And she is a formidable adversary, as well as a considerable source of humor in the film. But, I mentioned Bond's patriotism. I think that the funniest, there's a lot of comedy in this film. The funniest moment of the film for me was after Bond's, they put him in this room, storage room or whatever, and he's not there. And one of the Germans shouts out in German, "The Englishman has escaped." And of course, that is the worst thing that any henchman of a supervillain would want to hear. Some pedant pointed out that the literal translation of this is "the Englishman has vanished," but I prefer the use of the more idiomatic "escaped" because he was their prisoner. And so we have what appears to be a happy ending, and a very unusual happy ending. In the books, unlike the movies, Bond does not really bed all that many women. There's a lot more in the movies, which most of them are fairly smirking about it, although On Her Majesty's Secret Service is not smirking at all. And we get a really shocking ending, which is something one wouldn't expect from a Bond film. As I mentioned before, this is my favorite of all the Bond films because of its relative seriousness. It's not dependent on gadgets. It has a great female lead in Diana Rigg, and it has a great villain in Ilse Steppert as Irma Bunt. All this crankiness from Q, Desmond Llewellyn, that's really kept to a minimum. And production value is absolutely outstanding. And I should mention that the dialogue was written, or most of it, by the English novelist Simon Raven. And it is clearly superior to the dialogue that one is used to hearing in a Bond film. So those are my thoughts about On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And I highly, highly recommend it. And what are we going to be talking about on the movies next week? Well, just let me check here. Let me check. We are going to be talking about Orson Welles' 1958 film noir, A Touch of Evil, starring Welles, Marlene Dietrich, Charlton Heston, Janet Leigh. April 2nd, Seattle, 1992, Singles by Cameron Crowe. April 9th, Of Gods and Men by Xavier Beauvoir. And on April 16th, really beautiful, mysterious film by Matt Reeves called Let Me In. This guy made Cloverfield, and he made Let Me In, and he seems to be in director's jail. And who did he piss off in Hollywood? Because what he's making, he's working on a Spider-Man film. Both Let Me In and Cloverdale are outstanding, and I don't really understand how Hollywood works. Of course, as you know, tomorrow we're going to be discussing Kingsley Amos's The James Bond Dossier. March 27th, Volume 2 of Stephen Kotkin's magisterial biography of Stalin. April 3rd, Pensées by Blaise Pascal. April the 10th, Evelyn Waugh's biography of St. Edmund Campion. And on April the 17th, Walker Percy's rather remarkable self-help book called Lost in the Cosmos. I would like to thank you all for tuning in. I will remind you that I will be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time and 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. If you like the show or any part of it, I would appreciate it if you could click like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you would like to donate to the show, my PayPal address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Once again, thanks so much. Have a great night.